Well, thank you so much, Kieran, for joining me today. Very excited to talk about everything Return is doing, what it's building, what it's trying to build, its sort of mission and overall vision. But before Return Protocol, talk a little bit about your journey and your path to starting it and your path as a founder.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for having me. Excited to be on. Path has been like pretty windy, like for the most founders. So started when I was like 18, I guess, was like looking at going to like university or whatever and decided not to. And so ended up through like a few like random strokes of joining Tesla. And I was at Tesla for 2 years. And this was sort of in Europe when Model 3 had just launched. And so there was like a lot of opportunity to like try new things and do cool stuff. And regardless of like experience levels, because it was more so like, do we have someone with hands and feet compared
Nice,
to,
yeah.
do we have someone qualified? And so I love that. And so ended up sort of, I started literally the only way I could start with Tesla was with no degree, was just like selling because I could talk to people. And like eventually sort of ended up working on some operational projects, but through the delivery launch of Model 3 and sort of in Europe and the UK. And then decided to move on, gosh, in late 2020, no, a little while, probably late 2020. And sort of alongside that for a little while, I'd been sort of moonlighting with a company called Lasso, who was sort of building a hardware recycling device that goes in your kitchen to sort of create this like alternative recycling stream to the municipal system to like enable 100% closed loop recycling. So worked on that for sort of 3 years actually. Sort of ended up was the COO for a little while, and then moved on from there for about 18 months ago, and sort of through both places really highlighted. We was on projects for both to try and figure out how we could use carbon credits to give to the consumers of the products to incentivize them to buy them.
Yep.
Because both of them were applicable for that, and found it very difficult. And then sort of through that, sort of went down the rabbit hole of like on-chain carbon, and that sort of in theory solved those problems. And so that sort of, long story short, how it eventually led into starting Return. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's always an interesting road to get to where we are now. When thinking about building something, when you sort of go down that road of making a decision, I guess, what was the thought process like? Was there any aha moment where, you said, okay, I want to build Return. I want to build something that scales socially and scales incentivizing climate action, with blockchain and Web3. Like, I guess, how do you get to that point? What was that thought process of building it? Was it somebody that talked to you about it? Was it a friend network? I guess, how did you even come up with this idea to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think initially, very initially, so I've always had the founder itch. And I
Yep.
think in my head, I've always been like going through these like different routes to like prepare myself to be a founder. Well, then like in reality, as you know, nothing prepares you to be a founder. And so I think that was like in my head, like justification. But honestly, I think when I was preparing to start Return, I sort of naturally sort of been thrown into like the on-chain carbon space per se, and was like very motivated to try and attack the problem that had like originally presented itself, which was like, how can you scale climate action to such a point where it becomes a default rather than like a luxury.
Right.
And that was really like the spark that drove the initial idea, I guess. And the way the initial idea formed was honestly just like watching. So this was probably when Klima and Toucan just launched, of like watching that like eruption of like activity, and then talking to a lot of people that had just come into the space and trying to understand like what they really wanted, and like what climate people had used to, or did they want to take climate action? Probably yes, but then like what the people that didn't want to take climate action wanted.
Right. No,
like
it's a great question to ask. Perfect. Yeah.
yeah, because I feel like the most things out there right now are tailored more so to like that early adopter than like the mass
Yep.
scale. And that was really our initial spark, which was like, how can we really help scale this? And that was really the value we thought we could create.
Yep, that's great. Let's get into what Return actually is, or in what it plans to sort of be. And like you said, I think it's perfect when we because sometimes we get in the vacuum, right? We're sort of, in our own space, in our own sector, and then we don't think outside of it. And that's kind of where the growth can really sort of happen. I guess if you're explaining Return to maybe a person that's not in the climate space or dedicating their day-to-day life within, whether it's the refi space or the climate tech space or the conservation space, outside of your network, when somebody asks you, hey, what is Return? What are you building? How do you explain it to them?
That's a great question, and so true. I feel like we get caught up in like our own like buzzwords and like our own little echo chambers that like you don't really remember that like most people don't understand that, and so or they don't align with it. And so the way I would usually explain return is we feel that one of the large problems that exists with consumers in general that have the options to take climate action and don't, is that really like, why do you do anything? And the two things we came back to is you do things when you get a benefit. And the benefit we felt that a lot of people had tried to attack was like payment. And we didn't feel that like a sustainable process could exist to pay someone to do something good.
Right.
And so we sort of felt like, how can you really make it attractive for an individual to do something good for the planet, such as what return initially is, which is buying carbon credits, and which are like a way to help fund carbon projects on the ground that like sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And so we very much felt that the one niche that we could attack to start with was social proof. And luckily enough, these tools had started to form that allowed you to create like a very transparent, auditable, like digital identity almost, but that represents your real sort of life climate impact. So with that premise being like in the world eventually that as the real world in general intersects with digital, like when our lives as they are already more aligned with like our digital identity than our in-person identity, could we leverage that whole landscape to help people want to take climate action? And so that's what Return is we're a platform and people can go onto the platform, see real world climate projects that they'd like to support, and then they can create an impact identity, which is this digital form of themselves. We're trying to make it, and then they can customize it and play with their friends and sort of gamify things for themselves to really like understand and make it more of a collaborative, fun social event rather than just I've just offset my personal emissions, which we feel is fine, but sort of misses the large point that like, again, coming from the Tesla angle, like people don't buy Tesla. Some people do, but the large proportion of people don't buy Teslas because they're cool. Oh, it's better because they're sustainable. They buy them because they're like a great product and they're fast and they're fun. And that's sort of roughly where we're trying to go to is, can we make a platform that's like really fun to be on and like engage with, that by default it means you can do it.
And so right now, sort of incentivizing with sort of the digital passport, feature and idea. As you go down further in the path of just building out a product and a platform, there's going to be so many different ways to make things happen, I guess, and make decisions on, hey, let's implement this feature and this feature and this feature. I guess how do you and the team think about like adding new features and building the product obviously in the early stages and still building foundationally, but how do you think about actually building features for the products? Is it feedback from users? Is it feedback from investors? I guess, how do you go about building a product? Like, what's your philosophy there?
That's such a great question, and I'd be interested in your thoughts as well, because I think it's very varied. So I think what we've sort of come up against a little bit is like with anything consumer, you sort of end up in this space of like you are attacking a problem, but like it's not the traditional startup model where you're a B2B company, there's a business that has this problem, you've got a solution, you'll sell them the solution, and you scale from there. Not that that's easy, because everything is hard.
Sure.
But that's the traditional like. And so we sort of struggled a little bit in the early days anyway, to like merge the two of like, we're somewhat trying to build something that people don't necessarily know they need or know they have the problem for. But then, like you say, we do also have these early users that like are amazing and have these really great input points. And so we've tried to strike this balance between, and still very much work in progress, of what do users tell us that they really want? And then also, what does the data of the usage of the platform show that people want? And then like the third pillar, which is like, what do we think people will want in the future? And we found that very hard to balance. Because like with any team, more than one person, everyone has opinions. And like in those early days, like you say, when you do have data, that's great, but largely it's based on opinion. And so it's very much, we've tried to get super disciplined at like building out a product roadmap, building out a pipeline of like feature improvements and like what is a feature, what is a bug. Like, the scope creep and bugs become features and features become products and then you end up doing something different. So that's been our like how we tried to traverse it. We'll be interested in how your 2 cents on that.
You mentioned users log into the platform, and I guess their first step is just buying carbon credits, right? At sort of a foundational level. Where does those carbon credits come from? I guess who are you partnering with to actually for the supply part of it?
Yeah, it's a question. So we, the only carbon credits, we're sort of in a piloty stage right now. So the only carbon credits we've provided access to as a pilot stage are the ones we could easily access. So the ones we
Yep.
can easily access at the moment are through Toucan's Carbon Bridge. And
Yep.
so we selectively redeem the top 2-3 projects within Nature Carbon Ton, the Toucan token. And we also, it depends upon the community campaign you go for. So with the return campaign, that's the sort of generic basic choice.
Yep.
Or we've just launched a Polygon campaign. Polygon are sort of, as part of their whole scheme and strategy, did include some sort of debatably high quality credits in soil carbon from Nori. And so you sort of have the option of either going for the return campaign or the Polygon campaign at the moment. And the Polygon campaign gives you some soil projects from farmers on the ground, or the sort of return campaign gives you typically sort of afforestation, forestry projects.
Because Return raised a little bit of money recently, so congratulations there.
Thank you.
What was that process like, raising for a sort of Web3 climate gamification? Because there's just not many out there, right? That are kind of attacking it from your angle. I guess, what was the process like fundraising for something that there's not really a comp to right now or yet?
We got really lucky that we met the right people at the right time. The very brief fundraising story is that we weren't planning to raise. We were okay sort of testing the thesis a little bit and then looking to go from there. But luckily enough, we sort of met a really amazing investor that sort of supported us all the way, called Ed from Allegory. And he was very much like the first guy who was like, I would love to help support. And that made us think, well, maybe we should raise some more. And so that was then the forming of the round. But in answer to your question, it was really difficult at points. We raised just before the downturn.
Yeah.
And so we were vaguely lucky in that regard. But honestly, it's very much and we were pre-seed. And so it was very much about what is this really bold vision that we're trying to paint, and how do we make it understandable? Because when it's a consumer thing, I feel that it's probably a little bit harder, because in theory everyone is a consumer, and so the investor is would I buy this thing? But when it's a SaaS tool, they don't need to, because they wouldn't buy the thing anyway. And so we found that quite an interesting picture to paint. Yeah, but got there in the end. But yeah, did find it a lot of the vision. What does this look like in 10 years' time, as most pre-seeds do.
Sure.
Yeah, I feel consumer pre-seeds, especially you say Web3 consumer digital identity pre-seeds, which there aren't that many of.
So I think the really cool part about all of this is the incentivizing and sort of this rewards model. Eventually, how can that become the real attraction? I'd love to just double click on that for a second, and just what are some of the interesting incentives and rewards that could come down the line, right, for users eventually? Because I think this is the real path where I think really interesting things could happen.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's for us, we're at this initial starting stage where you really don't have the network effects. You're really just trying to get the initial user base. And so that's really where we're at. The really exciting things for us, we think, like you say, as you can do more with that digital identity. And so you could totally see a world where you taking climate action, or first of all, not only the fact that you've done this thing, buying carbon credits gives you a digital identity, you could see a world where everybody has a digital identity, and automatically you could see all of your emissions in an accounting model, everything you've done, everything you haven't done, what are the things you could do, what are they not. And so we think that as a step one, where your digital identity sort of draws in all of that data, could be super cool. And then that opens up a whole world of opportunity where you can have that in the Web3 space specifically, you can have specifically sustainable user gated things. You can then have real world gated things, so such as the typical gifting models and cool cards and all of that good stuff. And then you could eventually get to this point where via some really lucky but good network effects, you have this core community of sustainable people. And our very audacious, bold long-term goal is a little bit, I don't know if you follow Yes Theory at all on YouTube. But there's a really cool community where they brought I think they're 8 million subscribers or whatever, that bring this really cool core group of people together that all believe in this one thing, which is for them is seeking discomfort and that thought process. And so for us, you could totally see a world where bringing sustainable people together where it eventually becomes the standard for like social intervention and activity could just drive mass adoption of everyone to do that thing. And then that like is the snowball for like every company wants to be sustainable. Every company wants to support sustainable things. You as a user are innately better off having this like impact identity to your name. I don't know, in an end state world, do you get a better credit rating? Do you get better like real world things that you need as a human being? Can that benefit you from being sustainable?
And even in even simpler forms, right? Just access to in real life, things, right? And I love when we can merge, the digital Web3 environment into the real world. I know some people don't love that, but I think that's, I think when you talk about community, I think it's still, as humans, we still connect so much better in real life. And I think to build, a really real community that's based on similar values and similar visions, that real world variable is like so important still, I think.
I couldn't agree more. And like I feel like in Web3, we typically get caught up in like this echo chamber bubble, like we said earlier. But like at the end of the day, most people, maybe as the future in the future more will, but like most people do have to have like a not digital life. And so the point when you can like make that a part of your experience innately becomes a better user experience for the customer or like for your community member, rather than like having to hang around in Discord. Don't know about you, I really dislike using Discord. So, like something real life would be great.
Yeah. No, totally. I usually like to end a little bit of like the future. And I know, it's so early on, pre-seed funding, like building out foundational tech at the moment, building out features. Like we're started at the really, really early stages, which is a fun time, right, to be in.
Yeah.
But as you look, maybe 3 to 5 years down the line where the functionality gets more serious, you're really building out a high-end product that hopefully scales and gets, some level of mass adoption. I guess, what are some of the goals and successes you would like to see in the next 3 to 5 years? Whether it be building out certain things, or onboarding people. I guess, what do you and the team talk about, as a long-term vision?
That's a really great question. I think the long-term vision of what we're doing is how can you integrate this more with a person's everyday life, the point where everything's automatic. And so I think you could totally see an end state in 3 to 5 years where you have this digital identity that sort of has somewhat merged a little bit with your input, like with your regular everyday identity, and that like your actions on a day-to-day basis are represented in this like scorecard identity thing. And then from that, like you then have this like suite of incentivization tools that you can plug into, like for example, it's a very random case, but like for example, if you decide to bike instead of car today, like bike to work instead of driving, do you get like $3 off your sandwich at lunchtime? Like, is there a world where we can like really seamlessly tie action, like cause to effect of your like life? And that's really what motivates us at the moment. And like, we have a lot of conversations like that. But also quite challenging to like bring that down and build stuff. But like in an end state, you could totally see that becoming like a thing that should exist in the world. So yeah, that's the end state.
Well, thank you so much, my man. Thank you. I know you're busy. You're deep into building at the moment every day. Thanks for taking the time, and best of luck for you and the team for the next decade, my man.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was awesome to chat. And yeah, big fan of the podcast. So yeah, great to be on.